there is an extraordinary revolution taking place in developing countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I discovered this for myself about a decade ago, 11 years ago, when I was working in Hyderabad in India, looking at elite schools and colleges on a commission from the International Finance Corporation, getting a bit fed up with that, thinking that wasn't my mission to see how the elite were doing. I went down into the slums and poor areas of Hyderabad on a day off, and I found a private school, very quickly. Walking it down, finding a private school, in those days charging around $1 or $1.50 per month. And then I found one, and I walked down another alleyway, found a second one, and then a third, and very soon got introduced to a federation of these low-cost private schools in the slums and poor areas of Hyderabad, which had 500 members. And I was incredibly excited by this, because talking to those entrepreneurs who were running these schools, they were clearly businesses, talking to the parents who were sending their children to these schools when the government schools were free, I thought, this is a revolution here. This is something quite remarkable that has huge implications for education for all. I went back to Washington, D.C., fired up by what I'd seen here, and I met with a complete stonewall. People said, Tooley, you're exaggerating what you're seeing. You've maybe found a couple of businessmen ripping off the poor. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem right. So I managed to get funding from the John Templeton Foundation, and I looked at across Africa and India, and in places like Makoko, that shanty town built into stilts in the Lagos Lagoon. As you travel from the airport across to Victoria Island, you'll see the shanty town down there. Everyone says it's too dangerous to go there, so of course I took a canoe down to see what was going on there, and very quickly found a low-cost private school. And when we did our survey, we found 32 low-cost private schools within that one community. Then we went to Ghana, to the coconut groves of the Atlantic coast, to fishing villages like Bocciano here, and very quickly found a low-cost private school charging maybe $4 or $5 equivalent per month. To Kenya, to slums made quite famous now in recent years by films like The Constant Gardener, Kibera in Nairobi. Where does this boy go to school? I think you're guessing by now. He goes to a low-cost private school in the slums there. There are about over 100 low-cost private schools in the slums of Kibera, in the slum of Kibera and other slums across that region. And even in remote rural China. Oh, there's other schools there. Remote rural China, you know the people there well. Remote rural China. Even in remote rural China, where I'd been talking at a conference like this in Beijing, talking about low-cost private schools for the poor in India and Africa. And it feels almost embarrassing, those of you who know China now, to be talking about poor people when you're in such a modern, high-tech city as Beijing. And anyway, someone told me from the DFID, the British aid agency, said, well, we're working in the poorest province in China, Gansu province in the northwest. And we know rural China like the back of our hands, and there are no private schools there for the poor. And so this was like a red rag to this bull, and I went on the next convenient flight to Lanzhou, the capital of Gansu, went out into rural areas like this I had a student with me. We went talking to parents, to people in the markets. This was a good place. Getting up early, 5 o'clock, going to the marketplaces, talking to people about where there were schools, and eventually getting told that we can travel for 2 days, abandoning our car and going into the mountains, some of the most remote mountains I've ever been to. And there at the end of a journey was a little low-cost private school, charging a couple of dollars per month, serving mainly girls. There was a public school, a government school available for them. It was 3 or 4 hours walk away, and so the parents wanted their children to go there. We did big surveys. We did surveys now we published in the reputable journals. But the headline figure, here's a headline figure from Lagos State in Nigeria. The children in government schools, and these are all poor children, these are surveys of poor areas. The children in government schools are only a minority, quarter, 26% of children are in government schools there, and fully 3/4 are in these low-cost private schools. But the figure there, I'm colourblind, the one underneath the government schools, the 33%, those children are in private, unrecognised schools, completely off the government's radar. No one knows they exist, or no one knew that they existed until really we started talking about this recently. So that's the reality there. We tested 24,000 children in 3 subjects, maths, English, and 1 other subject, Hindi in Delhi, Kiswahili in Kenya, Urdu in Hyderabad. And we found a similar picture, more or less identical across all these studies. Towards the other speakers, maths, in the middle English, Hindi on my side. The red is the government schools, the blue is the unrecognised private, and the yellow is the recognised private. These are the raw scores, but then when you controlled for all the background variables, the differences were still remaining. The private schools, the children in the private schools were significantly outperforming the children in the government schools, and it was all for a fraction of the cost. So I've been celebrating that. There's a fraction of the cost, though. There's salaries, you'll see quickly. I've been celebrating this for some time now. I wrote a book about it, The Beautiful Tree, and have been now extending the work into conflict areas in Africa, Sierra Leone, I believe, Somaliland, and also Zimbabwe. We can afford the exchange. And I wrote this book, but meanwhile, why are parents going to these schools? What is it about these schools? Well, meanwhile, in the government school year, this is the same day as I went to some thriving, low-cost private schools in the slums of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And on the same day, going to the government school, there was nothing going on, nothing at all. And this was the reason why parents tell us they prefer these low-cost private schools. Or how about this? We went with a BBC crew to Makoko, the shantytown I showed you there in the stilts on the Lagos Lagoon. And we went with a BBC crew, we went announced to the government school. We were filming in the private schools, then we went to the government schools on the periphery of the slum. We were announced, they knew we were coming, it was in teaching time, and we were accompanied by the Deputy Commissioner of Education. And the very first, you couldn't make this up, the very first classroom we visited with the BBC crew, the teacher was fast asleep at his desk. The children jumped up to welcome us, the children sang in welcome to us, still the teacher slept. And we showed this on Newsnight a few years back around the Glen Eagles conference, if you remember. We showed it on Newsnight, and I edited the voice of the Commissioner of Education over this, saying, in the past we had problems with our teachers. He was a very erudite Oxford PhD. In the past we had problems, but now our staff are well-trained and well-disciplined. But I would not have shown that. I would not have allowed, in a sense, this teacher to take the rap for this if it's not every time you go into a government school in poor areas in the countries I'm talking about, you will find a teacher asleep, you'll find, like the previous slide, nothing going on at all, or you'll find teachers doing as little as they can. In Ghana, where I'm working now a lot, you'll know this my friend there in Ghana, in the poor parts where I'm working there, the government school teachers put their desks, their tables outside the classrooms. They have a nice veranda, and so you'll see all the teachers sitting outside on the verandas and the children inside, because the classrooms are hot and noisy and dirty. So they sit outside and read their newspapers and talk. And the other thing you'll notice, whenever you go to a government school in the areas that I'm working now, and I promise, I put money on this, you could come with me and you'd see this. Whenever you go there, it's always break time. That's 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10, 10:30, 11. There's always break time. And the head teacher will say, apologies, oh, you've arrived at break time, sorry. And that's the reason why parents are going to these low-cost private schools, because the children are not abandoned. In these public schools, the children are abandoned. That's what we're told. So I wrote a book about it. You're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but I'm quite happy if you judge this book by its cover. It's a rather beautiful cover, The Beautiful Tree, documenting this evidence over the years. But in terms of development, in terms of the whole idea of entrepreneurship and development and aid, these are, in a sense, the Holy Grails of development, if you'll perhaps I shouldn't be sacrilegious in an environment like this. Anyway, if you'll excuse the sort of the illusion there. But sustainability and scalability, these are the holy grails of development. And the extraordinary thing about the low-cost private schools that are in existence already, they are already sustainable individually. These are businesses, run as businesses, and they are surviving, if not thriving as businesses. But they're also scalable because there are extraordinarily many of these schools. Our estimates are at least 300,000 of these across India alone, and 80, well, I put that estimate up now to 100,000 of these low-cost private schools in Anglophone West Africa alone. These are huge phenomena. So if you like the Holy Grail for development, these have been found within this phenomenon. However, there's still much to be done. If you like, the choices for poor parents at the moment are these three. Send to a government school where parents tell us, in general, often our children are simply abandoned. You can send your child not to school at all, which actually is a very rational response if you live in one of these areas where the schools are not functioning. Or you can send to a low-cost private school, which our evidence, and now other people are following this evidence, the evidence shows these schools are better. But they're not really good enough, and it's not me saying they're not good enough. It's really people within those schools, people who are running the schools, or parents or teachers. They tell us they're not good enough, and it's partly because the government school bar is set so low. The low-cost private schools are better, but the bar is set so low. So we've been thinking lately of a fourth choice. A fourth choice for parents. And I took a couple of years, 3 years unpaid leave from the University of Newcastle, where I am, and went to live in Hyderabad, India, and then Ghana, and trying to create this idea of, how can we get higher quality, low-cost private schools? And the way we've focused on in both India and Ghana, and now, God willing, starting in Sierra Leone in September, is to create chains of these schools. The idea being that if you've got a chain, a brand name, you've solved the information problem for parents. How do they know they can trust you? You have economies of scale. You can, within the chain, you can afford to invest in R&D and curriculum and learning improvements and technology and so on. You can do a lot within a chain. So could a chain like this be sustainable and therefore scalable? Well, the good news is we started this chain, Omega Schools, just outside of Accra, Kaswa in Ghana, about an hour and a half west of Accra. And we started it just over 2.5 years ago. Our first school was opened 2 years ago in September. And we now have 6,000 students in 10 schools, but the good news is we've broken even this year and no longer have to put any more funding into that chain. And so we have now got a for-profit education model for the poor, which is sustainable, and therefore we can scale it now. We can scale it perhaps in units of 10 across Ghana, across West Africa, and in other places. So this is tremendously exciting. But just want to tell you a couple of things about this chain. So one of these things is to do with innovation. People often think innovation, and our next speaker no doubt will be talking about innovation and technology and so on. But innovation can be incredibly simple and incredibly effective. And I like to think that this innovation we've got in terms of our all-inclusive daily fee model in the school is an extraordinary one, because it's both extending access and therefore extending access for children to a higher quality education. And it's based on the ideas, I don't know if you've read Poor Economics by Duflo and Banerjee, the MIT scholars. It's a pretty good book, and they talk about, if you're doing economics for the poor, you've really got to get into the minds of poor people and understand where they're coming from. I think this is that.